Hey everyone, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and today we are going to continue our conversation on the subject of Saturn into Pisces by looking at all 12 sun and rising sign horoscopes. So the reason for doing this is following on yesterday's conversation about some of the archetypal themes that you might see when Saturn enters the sign of Pisces. Check that out from yesterday if you haven't seen it yet. Today we want to say, well, in what area of life might I observe those kinds of themes or archetypal qualities appearing? And so we're going to take it through rising sign by rising sign and give you a sense of what to expect given what whole sign house Saturn will be moving into. Remember, it's spending time there all the way from 2023 March to into 2026. So it's got a long stay ahead in this whole sign house of your birth chart. Now, I recommend rising sign horoscopes always. If you're someone who just insists on listening to your sun sign horoscope, that's fine too. You could listen to whatever sign is applicable. But I recommend going with your rising sign since that will actually match with the whole sign house arrangement of your birth chart. So before we get into it, I always appreciate if you give this video a like and subscribe. If you're not a subscriber already to my channel, you can share a few comments. And if you have any grabbed stories to share on my channel, I always ask people to share a story. How have the planets showed up in your life? Use the hashtag grabbed. One of the ancient names for the planets were the grahas or the grabbers. So we try to look at those funny stories when they just show up and sort of, jump into our lives unexpectedly, unannounced. And then, if we study astrology, you realize in hindsight, they make for really good storytelling episodes. So we do those occasionally. In the meantime, you can always find a transcript of any of my daily talks on the website, nightlightastrology.com. I also want to tell everybody, just in case you follow me on Instagram or in the YouTube comments section or on Facebook, occasionally content creators like myself are dealing with scammers who impersonate us, and they'll send you DMs trying to get you to, send money to them or something like that. So be aware of that. I never DM people. The only way you'll ever get a reading is if you book it through my website, never in DM or text message or WhatsApp or anything like that, or in the comments section. I'll never hit you up for anything. The only place that I'll ever ask you to donate is through the official Kickstarter page at the end of the year when I do my annual fundraising drive to support my content creation. So just don't be taken advantage of by those people. It's really annoying that they do that, but yeah, it's like whack-a-mole. They do it every single week, it seems like. So, and I'm not the only one who's dealing with it, by the way. It's like there's tons of people dealing with this. It's really unfortunate. Anyway, on that terrible note, I also want to point you to my website, nightlightastrology.com, where anything that I'm selling officially, a reading or classes, you would have to get here, never through some person saying, hey, I'm in your DMs. You want to let me give you a reading for just send money to this weird account. So if you go to my website and you go to the courses page, click on the first year course, you can learn more about my upcoming program, which is called Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. This is my my first year program. There's a first year and a second year course. We have a horary course, a couple other courses as well. So a really amazing curriculum that I've developed over the years with a whole team of people. We start on November 12th. Classes are 2 to 3 hours. You don't have to be there live for the webinars. They're all recorded for you if you can't make them live and kept on a class website where you get to access that forever. It's all perpetual lifetime access to all the material in the course. So if life interrupts you partway through, there's no sense of like, oh my God, you can do it at your own pace, or you can follow along live, hear what some of the students have to say by watching a video that we have there. At those 30 classes over the course of the year, we have some guest teachers that come in outside of those 30 classes. We've got tons of support from a tutoring staff that's there to answer questions year round in a discussion forum and in breakout study sessions, tons of bonus material. It is a 1-year immersion in astrology that is meant to help people develop a natal chart practice so that you can read for other people. It's meant to prepare you for that. At the same time, a lot of people just want to deepen their own knowledge of astrology. Look, being able to read your own chart for yourself for the rest of your life is an amazing skill, and being able to use it for the people you love, your spouse or partners or friends or family members. So whether you want to go pro or not, this program is designed for people who are just ready to get a little bit more serious about astrology and really study it. Early bird payment saves you $500 off. There's a payment plan. You can stretch it out over 12 months. If that helps. And then we also have need-based tuition. So we never want anyone to be priced out because of your budgetary constraints or, the bracket you fall in with, your day-to-day budget. It should be something that works for people, and that spiritual subject matter is not exclusive. So that's something I felt passionate about for a long time. And I encourage you to check out the need-based tuition option if you want to take one of my courses. But But you, for some reason or another, you can't afford it. So just email us, tell us your situation. You can click on the Apply Now button to do it. All right. So let's refresh on this just a little bit. Saturn moves into Pisces on March 7th of 2023. If you didn't check out yesterday's video on this, I recommend going back and listening to that so you can get a feel for some of the archetypal signatures of Saturn into Pisces, which I will not reiterate today. I will just be going through and giving you a sense of what to expect given the topics of the house Saturn will be landing in your birth chart. But there's a lot more to say that we'll also be looking at come springtime as well. So for now, what I want to do is I'm going to, through every sign, just give you a sense of what Saturn's placement in your birth chart might mean for the next couple of years, all the way 2025 and to 6 before we see Saturn moving into Aries. So starting in March of 2023, we're all going on a Saturn and Pisces adventure, which should be pretty cool because we've all been on a Saturn and Saturn's own sign adventure for a long time now, going on 5 years, since December of 2017, essentially. All right, well, let's begin with Aries sun or rising sign horoscopes. That is going to place Saturn into the sign of Pisces in your 12th house. Now, this was called the house of Saturn's joy. If you are an Aries rising, when Saturn goes into this house, there is all of the stuff that you've been neglecting psychologically, all of the things that you've been repressing, all of the material that you want to avoid, or maybe you've neglected, will start to force its way into your awareness. And it will do so at first through, sometimes in ways that are not as obvious. It's like it starts knocking on the door. And after a while, the door gets, the pounding at the door, the knock turns into a pound, and then it can turn into a kick, and then the door can be kicked in. The reason for that is that this 12th house was considered to be something of a blind spot for the native. And so when Saturn goes into this house in the sign of Pisces, you can expect that some of your quietest longings and desperations, some of the things that you've been holding on to and unwilling to let go of or sacrifice, some of the burdens that you carry and maybe you've not taken the time to examine whether they are worth carrying or not. These are the kinds of things that are likely to come up, and slowly and gradually, and at first in ways that you will not be able, sometime you probably won't be able to make them conscious. They won't make total sense right away. It's like there's something gestating in the unconscious, and it may nag at you or show up in strange ways, and eventually you'll start putting you'll connect the dots. And you'll eventually start to see the constellation of events that are happening as trying to bring your awareness to things that need to change, things that sacrifices that need to be made, and reform that needs to be brought about psychologically and spiritually in order to live a more whole and healthy life, which by the time Saturn enters your first house, you'll be, in a sense, be ready to take on. So a lot of what happens when Saturn moves into your first is, now I'm ready to take on things that I have been making conscious slowly and sometimes painfully. Let's take and look at Taurus next. So we're going to put, here we go. We're going to put Taurus on the ascendant, and we're going to highlight Saturn in the 11th house. So Saturn in the 11th house is an interesting one. I am a Taurus rising, and so I have reflected back on previous experiences of Saturn in Pisces, and they can typically go in a couple of different directions. When you think of the 11th house, you're often thinking about allies, friends, and your sense of, where do I fit in socially, or what are my social, professional, public ambitions? What am I trying to make of myself in the world? And Saturn in the 11th house can suggest a changing of the guard in terms of your community. For example, people know who watch my channel. Recently, I've taken a step away from, the Hare Krishna community that I was a part of. And in doing so, it makes sense that the next period coming up would be a Saturn in the 11th house period, sort of a time to reconfigure who my people are. And it could be very well be a time where I don't feel like that's clear, or I feel alone. When I was in high school, the last time that Saturn was in Pisces, we had just moved, and I was going through a feeling of being socially displaced. But it was a time where I also ended up reconfiguring my friends and my friendship circles in a way that was really pretty profound. But it took a lot of time and work, and there was a kind of changing of the guard that was painful. So it's very natural when Saturn goes through the 11th house for there to be, you're carrying the cross when it comes to like, where do I fit in? Where do I belong? And that could be in terms of, academically, intellectually, politically, among friends, religiously. It could, be any sphere. Also professionally, like what are my long-term ambitions and what sacrifices am I willing to make? And what kinds of sacrifices should I make to be well liked or well received? Saturn in the 11th house can play quite a bit on the theme of popularity. So a lot of lessons surrounding those things. Those are the themes, the main themes I would look for in the 11th house. Also, sometimes, just difficult losses or transitions around not just like groups of friends, but specific friends, sometimes specific friendships. All right, well, let's go to Saturn in the 10th house in Gemini, with Gemini rising. So when Gemini is rising, then Saturn goes into the 10th. It's going to spend a long period of time in the 10th house. The 10th house is associated with the workaday world. And so your vocation can change, or within an existing vocation, things can get quite a bit more serious. Saturn in the 10th house can be about accomplishment for a lot of hard work that's being done. But at the same time, Saturn in the 10th house can be about boredom or exhaustion or lethargy within the work that you're doing. So the hard work can pay off with Saturn in the 10th. You can feel exhausted and dead and sort of disillusioned, or it can signify for that reason career changes. I'm done with this. I can't do it anymore. The ending of a job, the ending of something like that. You can also make pretty significant changes in your public reputation. I think it's interesting, for example, that recently, again, just to use some examples from my own chart, since those of you who follow my channel would be familiar with this, Saturn in my 10th house right now in the sign of Aquarius, because I'm a Taurus rising, and when it opposed my ascendant ruler, coincided with a public change of name back to my given name, and a kind of a very public announcement. So it's very easy for Saturn in the 10th house to have something to do with who and what you are or want to be known for publicly within your job, the title that you have or the role that you play or the sense of calling or purpose that you serve. Saturn will make you think very seriously about it, and it can be very heavy, especially when you're not loving what you're doing or it doesn't feel totally authentic or something like that. So those are the kinds of things that I would watch for with Saturn moving into the 10th house in the whole sign of Pisces for Gemini risings. All right, let's go to Cancer. When we put Cancer on the ascendant, Saturn goes into the 9th house. Now, Saturn in Pisces in the 9th house could suggest spiritual or religious conversion. It could suggest spiritual, religious disillusionment or disappointment. It could suggest a crisis of faith. It could suggest a committed vow to a monastic order. So it's just, it either tends to go in the direction of becoming more like serious about something, committed, maybe even austere, or it can go in the direction of, it can move in the direction of feeling a sense of fatigue or exhaustion, or feel like the well has dried up spiritually, intellectually too. You can be at an intellectual crossroads where some kind of paradigm change is needed. Teachers can change. Teachers could kind of metaphorically die. On the other hand, you could find a teacher or school or set of teachings or study or curriculum that you become very devoted to, but in the sense of sacrifice and hard work that is associated with Saturn. There could be some kind of hard work that's done overseas or abroad, where you could also find yourself, becoming more almost like politically or ideologically committed to something or disillusioned with something. So it can kind of go either way, but usually it's kind of an extreme. I feel really unsure of something, or I feel like I want to make a vow. There's not usually a sense of nothing going on in that house. And, Saturn will really bring it. I like this as a mystical placement for Saturn, as a place of contemplatives, mystics, sacred alone time, becoming more deeply devoted and committed to something, but something that is also maybe a little otherworldly, or maybe at times too austere. You have to be careful of that too. Okay, so let's we'll continue now by putting Leo on the ascendant. which takes Saturn into the 8th. Now, Saturn in Pisces in the 8th house may have a lot to do with the sacrifices you are making on behalf of other people that you love or know or need something from you. On the other hand, it could speak to the burdens or obligations you have to other people that are weighing you down and slowly will create almost like an existential or emotional crisis. I can't carry this for you anymore. You have to do it on your own. I can't be responsible for someone else's pain or suffering. Or for the sake of, my ego, I take on too much, and then, there's a consequence to pay psychologically or emotionally for doing so. On the other hand, Saturn in Pisces in the 8th could mean that there is a change in the status of a partner or spouse's money or income or finances, either taking on more responsibility or taking on more debt, but it would be something probably a little bit more pronounced in either direction. Saturn in the 8th could mean that a spouse is gaining a greater title and responsibility in the workplace and earning more money. It could also mean that a spouse suddenly lost their job and everything falls on you. It really depends on the rest of the karma of the chart, so to speak. But Saturn in the 8th can also be about the ways in which we are bound to other people, for better or worse, and what other people bring to us that aids us, that helps us carry and endure life together. And there's a seriousness around it, though, soul bonds that are growing deeper and more committed and entangled. And there's always, that can stop your heart. That can be a little scary. The subject of death and loss, grief and fear can come up more seriously when Saturn is in the 8th. But so too can the sense of sharing the burden and finding meaningful ways of sharing the burden, hopefully without delving into almost like codependent territory or martyr territory. All right, well, let's put Virgo on the ascendant, and Saturn then goes into the 7th. With Saturn in the 7th house, we're now thinking about romance. Now, you have two directions that this can go as well. Saturn in the 7th, present when people are taking their vows, their oaths, they're becoming more serious or committed to one another. Saturn in the 7th house is... Saturn in the 7th is, a place where we take up the cross of, a long-term commitment to someone, which is a burden. No matter how romantic we want it to be, there is sacrifice. We live to serve another human soul when we get into a committed relationship with them, whether it's for 3 months or 30 years. So Saturn can point to the deepening of commitment and the sense of loss and sacrifice that comes with giving ourselves to someone and bonding ourselves to someone in love. On the other hand, Saturn in the 7th can be about the end, the winter of love, the sense of the apocalypse. I'm seeing what I haven't been able to see, and it's bringing about a change. That change may include divorce. That change can include bittersweet breakups or loss, death of a spouse even at times. So that's pretty rare. But like Saturn in the 7th can, it can be about the heart-wrenching experiences around love. Saturn in the 7th can also be about sexuality and pleasure. Indian astrologers refer to the 7th house as kama, the place of pleasure. And so there's a lot there in the 7th house that has to do with sexuality and love. Saturn may be feeling blocked or prohibited from expressing itself. It may indicate something about being closed down emotionally to others, or the sort of love me little but love me long mentality that Saturn can bring to the 7th house, and the need for deeper emotional intimacy that Saturn in Pisces, may struggle to find at times, or on the other hand, the need that can't be fulfilled, the bottomless pit of neediness around love, sex, and so forth, that can't be filled, the sense of there being a black hole of pain that no partner could possibly fill for another person. These are the kinds of things sometimes Saturn in Pisces brings to the 7th. Now, Saturn in the 6th, if we put Libra on the ascendant, as soon as we put Libra on the ascendant, Saturn in Pisces is in the 6th house. This is a place that could speak specifically to sacrifice for a larger cause. Saturn in Pisces in the 6th. This is called the joy of Mars, and this has the most martyr-like feeling to me. But, well, of course, there's always the potential for a martyr complex or something like that, giving in the hope that we'll get, or sacrificing too much because we don't value or take care of ourselves well enough. Okay, potentially a problem with Saturn in the 6th house, to the point where people can get worn down and sick even. But Saturn in the 6th house can also be very much about the great work, the magnum opus that we have to pour a little of our own blood into. The sacrifices that we make for a larger vision, cause, belief, movement, vision. This has a Joan of Arc feeling to it. This has Mother Teresa serving the sick people in the slums of Calcutta. That it has that like going out into the world and serving people, like was it Che Guevara, who was some good Pisces energy, and he went, and as a doctor, I believe he worked with people who had leprosy. Someone tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that was part of his life trajectory as a doctor. Was he a doctor? And I'm pretty sure that's his story. Pisces guy, has some strong Pisces energy in his chart. Same idea in the 6th house. Work, the suffering servant motif, also sacrifice and toil. But with Saturn in Pisces, there's a romantic and beautiful sense of the sacrifice that's at work, which usually implies a larger vision or faith that's at work or at play in why someone is working or persevering through something. This is also about faith being tested through the hardships of love and sickness, and things like that. So you have to consider that too. Remember, Saturn is the exaltation of Venus, the 6th house, a place of sickness, Jupiter, a place of faith. So you're also talking about the challenges that we face, the trials and tribulations in our body or in love that can be deeply frustrating, but also open our hearts over time. All right, well, Scorpio in the 5th. Let's roll along here. So if you're looking at Saturn in the 5th house with Scorpio rising, this one's interesting because the 5th house was associated with pleasure, creativity, children, pregnancy. Saturn entering the 5th could mean, for example, that, look, you're going to become a parent, you're getting pregnant, and the whole world is changing as new responsibilities come into your life. I've seen Saturn in a water sign more times than I can count when a person says, I'm pregnant, and the mood around it is time to adult, So that could be it. On the other hand, to be completely frank, sometimes there are problems with children's education, development in your kids, attitude or behavioral problems in kids, repeating the patterns of family karma around your children and having to learn from it. Also, the topic of pregnancy and sometimes like losses of pregnancy, abortions or early terminations of pregnancy for one reason or another, or miscarriages. Sometimes that happens when Saturn's in the 5th. It's not the norm. I don't want to like freak people out, but sometimes there's more of a heaviness around the topics of pregnancy or children. But typically, at least in the lives of the people that I've worked with, these things become game-changing moments. There's often a sense of silver lining. This house was called the house of good fortune. And sometimes when losses come in around these vulnerable topics, they are like very important life-changing moments for people. So even if the scariest part of that, which is not the norm, but even if the scariest part of it were to happen to someone, I would say, look, a lot of people, doors end up opening through some of the losses of 5th house Saturn transits. For example, people in the 5th house, which is associated with pleasure, will often get sober when Saturn enters the 5th house, because they're reconciling with the consequential nature of Saturn in a house associated with pleasure. The other thing that can happen with Saturn in the 5th house that's not uncommon is if you tend to have a really repressive side, you don't know how to have fun, you're going to get drunk and go sing karaoke, right? You know what I mean? Like your Saturn in the 5th will help people loosen up, or it'll emphasize, I have a hard time having fun. So, and that's Saturn, it's the kind of thing you might have to work through. And what's the worst that can happen? Oh my God, I've loosened up. I have less goal-oriented thinking in my life. I'm more spontaneous and playful. Saturn people in general sometimes have a hard time with that. It's amazing how Saturnine people can bring, remember Saturn's exalted, and I have Saturn in its exaltation in Libra. So I'm totally good at this. You can talk a big game about joy and pleasure, and because you can make it sound very romantic. Like you would not believe how many people that are Saturnine can talk about art, music, culture, with a sense of like making you feel awe-inspired by how they can describe such things, but they still will be rather joyless people. It's like Oh God, that's been like definitely part of my year in the last year has been a lot of that. Like just like learning some of those little nuances in my own character and how to loosen up at a deeper level. That's Saturn stuff, especially when Saturn is combined with Venus. So you have Saturn in the joy of Venus in the fifth house, and in Venus, the sign of Venus is exaltation. So if that makes sense to people. Anyway, this has been like the overshare week for sure. I'm like, it's like what is you can always tell when if you have a collection of astrologers you watch, you can always tell when a transit has hit your astrologer because they'll be talking about their own chart for at least a week. So, okay, well, let's move along to put Capricorn on the, or excuse me. Whoops, I have overshot. Here we go. Sagittarius comes next. All right, let's put Sagittarius on the ascendant, which moves Saturn in Pisces into the fourth house. So you can see it down there at the bottom. Banner's covering it up just a little bit. So now we're talking about some of the deeper, more emotionally vulnerable territory when it comes to family karma. Your parents, your father and mother, their parents, the family patterns that have been passed down and inherited, and you're suddenly dealing with more seriously and deeply than you've ever really dealt with before. I'll never forget when Saturn was in my fourth house. Here I go again. And I was living next door to my grandfather, and this was my early 20s, or yeah, I was in my 20s, and Saturn was in the sign of Leo. And I remember it was just this really deep exploration of my father's karma and my grandfather's karma while Saturn was in Leo in the fourth house, and dealing with it and recognizing it within myself. Well, that led to my book. That material of living next to my grandfather led directly to the publishing of my book, because I ended up writing a sort of an ayahuasca adventure memoir, and it included the lineage of karma from my father and my grandfather. Well, that all happened while Saturn was in my fourth. So it's very, very common when Saturn's in the fourth house to go really deep into ancestral and family wounds and to excavate them and to bring healing about, because there's just more of a gravity. It's like there's a gravitational center when Saturn's in the fourth house that pulls you into orbit around these family issues, which, are not they're not meant to be a big deal in every moment of our life. But in certain seasons of our life, it's like, oh, it is time. It's time to go back to the well. It's time to draw deeply and, take a big, deep drink of the family patterns I've inherited. That's just sometimes what it is when Saturn's in the fourth. Saturn and Pisces in the fourth, also the sacrifices around family, home, land, real estate, and just generally your living environment. All right, let's move along to Capricorn. We're going to place Capricorn in the ascendant, which places Saturn and Pisces in the third. Now, karma around siblings, neighborhood, local environment, everything that is it's around you more immediately. Saturn in the third can have to do with your mindset, and it can have to do with a tendency to, on the day-to-day level, to struggle with control. I have a controlling mindset when Saturn is in the third house that tells me that, Saturn in the third can be that sense of like, everything's going to go to hell unless I have some order in my life. And sometimes Saturn in the third brings daily rituals and daily activities that prop us up and give us a sense of rhythm and stability. Other times, Saturn in the third has to do with a tendency toward mental rigidity and having to work on our mind and how we perceive and how we, for example, the third house was called the joy of the moon. And the third house has a lot to do with everything that circumambulates around the roots, the roots of our lives being where you live, your home base. And so it's kind of like the house that has a lot to do with biorhythms, mentally, physically, emotionally, in communication on the day-to-day. When Saturn's in that house, it's like, it's almost like a whole structural change might be needed with regard to how you think and how you speak and how you perceive, especially if it's too rigid or if it's too closed down. On the other hand, if it's too all over the place, Saturn in the third, what might come in and give you some more substance or structure. Those are the kinds of things that come to mind. Of course, again, siblings, neighbors, people who are like family to you, Those can also be important. Sometimes there's a sense of having to do a lot of travel or a lot of busy work, or like I remember specifically, here I go again, sharing a personal story. Sorry, I don't mean to overshare. Saturn in the third. When I had Saturn in the third, I was traveling back and forth constantly for graduate school, about an hour each way. And I thought it was really interesting because I was doing a lot of writing and reflecting and studying, but it was like my whole daily routine changed. It was this very austere, long commute that I did for several years, 2 years, while Saturn was going through the third house. Isn't that interesting? So watch for Saturn there to be like, also, do I feel at home? Like, it's not uncommon for Saturn in the third to coincide with living in an environment that culturally is like a mismatch for you and feeling out of place. And then this need to like find your way back to a sense of home, which then happens when Saturn ingresses into the next house, into the fourth. So it's not uncommon for there to be a sequence of getting into your roots while Saturn moves through your third and fourth respectively. All right, well, that's what I'm going to say about that. Let's put Aquarius on the ascendant. That puts Saturn into the second house. So when Saturn is in your second house, again, there's generally two ways in which it can go. It can kind of go toward like poverty and loss and constriction and loss of income and big expenditures and tight budgets. And, Saturn can kind of be a planet that, takes away, starves his children or eats his children or something like that. So Saturn can be just bringing hard times or lean times or like stricture or something like that. To the topic of money, finances, and resources. Now, that doesn't always last forever, and sometimes is accompanied by, like in order to address the situation, you have to look at your whole life. Well, how am I spending my time, my money, my energy, my resources? Am I in the right job? How much responsibility falls on me versus my spouse? All sorts of issues around the management of your time, energy, money, and resources, and all manner of issues pertaining to your work or your career can come up with Saturn in the second. And a lot of them can be really good and healthy, but there might be some periods of like leanness, or it's almost like the universe gives you that sign that things need to change because things aren't working. They're not fruitful anymore. Something stops growing in a garden. You just go, okay, well, I guess, I have to either replant it or plant something new or change my approach, because doing the same thing in terms of taking care of this plant is just not working anymore. It's not yielding the fruit any longer. So that can be really helpful feedback. And at first it might feel like, oh my God, but if we stay curious, then oftentimes it's just a sign of things that need to change so that things can become productive again. Saturn in the second also has the almost polar opposite extreme meaning of like working hard, like work the fields, see the fruit. Work the fields, though, is the part that you can't get around. There's a feeling that I have to work really hard right now, and my assets and resources are changing. For better or worse, they are just not the same. And so as a result of my income, assets, livelihood, or the means of my livelihood, changing, I've got to double or triple my work. Or you could say that you come up with a great new idea, and then you've got to work really hard to enact it. And then it does become fruitful, but it's like, well, for these 2 years, it's going to be like I'm putting more capital into it. It takes me a little bit to get out of the red. But, it's kind of an if you build it, they will come thing with Saturn in the second at times. So stick with it, sticking with things, knowing that it takes a lot of effort with Saturn in the second to see the garden grow is also good advice. All right, well, finally, let's put Saturn into the ascendant in Pisces. If you're a Pisces sun or rising, you get Saturn in your first house. Now, it's been in your 12th for a while, and we talked about this at the beginning when we started with Aries. The things that have been gestating in the unconscious, that have come into your awareness, that you are ready to now integrate into your personality, require sacrifice, require work, require growing up, and require a certain level of maturity that might be new or different somehow. There's a sense of, I'm ready to individuate to the next level, but it requires a certain kind of sacrifice, commitment, maybe a little bit of giving things up or being a little bit more disciplined or devoted to things. Sometimes at first it's discipline and then it turns into devotion. And that can definitely be the case with Saturn and Pisces. It's also in the first house about what you need to say no to. Saturn has a negating tendency. It says no to things. So Saturn in the first house can be about what I need to say no to so that I can be my most authentic, self, or take that next step in my personal development. And you can always feel, what does personal development even mean? Who knows? It's just that feeling that I need to become something new in a certain direction, and it feels integral. It feels there's a sense of integrity and a courage that's required to take that step. And Saturn will press on you. If you're not listening to it, it'll make it heavy, depressive. It can mess with your health a little bit in the first house. But if you're listening, kind of working with it, then often there's a sense of being also able to grow from it. Sometimes Saturn in the first is also just about burdens, that it's just time for the physical body to deal with, or changes to the physical body or appearance that need to be made because you're growing up and your wardrobe's changing, or because your metabolism is slowing down, or whatever the case might be. Saturn in the first says, I'm aging, I'm mortal. Saturn in the first can also be about, I know what I am, again, by saying what I am not. And how do I make that very clear during this time? That can be a part of the process as well. Saturn in the first can also just be about getting recognized more by people as an elder or an authority, or your wisdom or natural gifts or maturity is somehow coming to the light in other situations in your life, and you're getting recognized. It's almost like, people are saying, oh, look at that Saturn person. By that, it doesn't mean an insult. It could very well mean, look at that person who's very capable and mature, who's had to make tough decisions, and who's gotten really good at something. Those are the kinds of things you might also notice with Saturn in the first house. So that is what we've got for today. I hope that this was something that you all can make good use of. I always appreciate it when you like and subscribe and share some of your thoughts. Apparently that helps people pick up on the channel and the algorithm more. You can always find a transcript of any of my daily talks if you want to reread what has been said. That's nightlightastrology.com, where you can also check out the upcoming course, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. We start on November 12th. Let's go. I hope to see some of you in class soon. It is my favorite thing in the world to teach other people astrology so that they can take it to another level and transform their lives and read for other people. I like to think that we're helping keep astrology, the astrology torch, passing to other people too. So I want to train people who become successful readers, teachers, and can pass the love of astrology on to, new people and new generations of students. So hope to see some of you in class soon. Hope you guys have a great weekend, and we will see you again next week. Take it easy, everyone. Bye.